Okay, go.
Hello and welcome to the deep dive into the life of Louis Zamperini. Today we're going to be focusing on a war hero and Olympic runner. Louis was born on January 26, 1917 in Olean, New York. He moved to Torrance, California as a boy. As a boy, he was a troublemaker who was constantly running from the law. His older brother was very worried about him and asked the principal if he could run track. On page 13 of the book Unbroken, it reads, "He told the principal that Louis craved attention but had never won it in the form of praise, so he sought it in the form of punishment. If Louis were recognized for doing something right, Pete argued he'd turn his life around." Louis continued to train, and Pete often followed him around the neighborhood, riding his bike behind him, making sure he would train. On page 15, it reads, "Pete herded him out to train every day and rode his bicycle behind him, whacking him with a stick." As he trained more and more, Louis Zamperini became a very good runner. He even went on to the Olympics and broke the record for the fastest last lap in the 5,000 meter. On page 36, it reads, "His final time, 14:46.8, was by far the fastest 5,000 run for any American in 1936. Louis Zamperini had his sights set on the next Olympics, but was canceled due to the war. In December 1914, Pearl Harbor was bombed, which was an American catastrophe, and America ended up joining World War II. Because of this, Louis Zamperini joined the war. It reads in the book Unbroken, he joined the war on September 29th. On September 29th, he joined the Army. Okay. This is Louis Zamperini as a young boy. This was after Pete made him run track, and he broke many high school records. This was Louis' last lap of the 5,000 meter in the Olympics. And this is when Louis Zamperini joined the war. And now we'll go to commercial break.
Welcome back. Louis Zamperini's life was full of once-in-a-lifetime experiences. After leaving for war, Louis, a bombardier in the Air Force, had one of these. His crew bombed Wake Atoll, but crash-landed on their way home. A quote from the book: "Relieved of 3,000 pounds of bombs, Superman bobbed upward. Louis yelled bombs away, and Phil rolled the plane roughly to the left through steams of anti-aircraft fire." Most of his crew made it out of Wake Atoll, and in April of 1943, Louis and his crew bombed Nauru. Their plane was badly shot up, and they barely made it home alive. Many of Louis' crew members are injured, and some of them died, so they had to get a whole new crew other than Louis and Phil, who was the pilot, who miraculously made it out with little injuries. A quote from the book: "There were 594 holes. All of the Nauru bombers had made it back. Every one of them shot up, but none as badly as this. It's really a miracle that Superman made it back." On May 27, 1943, with a mostly new crew, Louis leaves on a rescue mission in a new plane, the Green Hornet. This plane is very rowdy and doesn't work well with the crew, and ends up crashing in the Pacific. Green Hornet was doomed. The best Phil could do was try to level it out to ditch. He grunted 3 words into the interphone: "Prepare to crash." This is a bomber heading to Wake Atoll for the bombing on December 22nd, 1942. After Nauru, Louis' plane was really badly bombed with Superman, and this is Louis looking through a hole on the plane to show you how big it is. On April 1945. And then on May 27th, 1943, Louis and his crew leave for a rescue mission, but end up crashing in the Pacific. This is the plane that they left on that was untrustworthy.
Welcome back. After Louis and his crew crash into the Pacific, life ultimately gets harder for him. First, only 3 out of the 11 passengers survived the initial crash, and only 2 would make it off the raft. Let's take a closer look. On day 1, Max starts to freak out as sharks graze the bottom of their 2 rafts. And on day 2, he eats all the ration chocolate. This shocked Louis, as the text reads, "The realization that Mac had eaten all the chocolate rolled hard over Louis," on page 138. Days later, and losing hope, the surviving crew spotted a plane. Shooting flares and yelling as loudly as possible, the 3 survivors tried to get the plane's attention but failed. Then it became clear to them that their chances of rescue were already dimming. On June 27, 1943, the 27th day of Louis' stay on the raft, a Japanese Zero plane flew by, shooting at the raft. While the odds of the 3 of them were surviving this were low, they made it out of the attack without a scratch. On the 33rd day, Mac died. Even though he ate all the rations on the second day, they were stranded on the raft. Mac did redeem himself by fending off sharks, and Louis would be forever grateful, for he had given all he had left, on page 172. On day 47, Louis and Phil spotted an island right before being captured by the Japanese. In May 1943, Louis and his crew were shot down. A few days later, Mac ate all the chocolate. A few days after that, while their hope was dimming, Louis and Phil and Mac tried to get a plane's attention by shooting a flare gun and putting powder in the water. After a few weeks, Mac died from starvation and dehydration. Then, after 47 days of being on the water, Louis and Phil, the 2 survivors, got captured by the Japanese. Now for a quick commercial break.
Hopes were high as Louis and Phil neared the island, only to be shattered by an approaching ship waving the Japanese flag. The frail men were captured and taken to what was known as Execution Island, Kwajalein. Treated harshly and put in cells, Louis and Phil neared death. "They can kill you here," Louis was told. "No one knows you're alive." Eventually, the day comes when the castaways are shipped back to Japan to live in an unregistered prisoner of war camp called Ofuna. Here, Louis and several other prisoners try to escape, but their plans are foiled. He and Phil are forced to part ways as Louis is taken to Omori, a horrible prisoner of war camp run by Mitsuhiro Watanabe, a psychotic man nicknamed the Bird. At one point, men from Radio Tokyo offer Louis a job as a propaganda tool for Japan. If Louis accepted, he would be taken to live in much better conditions. But Louis knew, as he said in the book, if he agreed to make this broadcast, he would be forced to live as his enemy's propagandist. But Louis, in the end, like all great heroes, remained loyal to his country and turned down the offer. Taken back to camp, the Bird beats Louis to no end. The conditions in camp get even worse, and so does the health of the poor, starved prisoners. On one glorious day, however, the Bird is restationed to a different camp, leaving Louis and the others in peace. Because of his refusal to work for Japan, Louis is later taken to a punishment camp called Naoetsu. By some stroke of bad luck, the Bird happens to be the leader of this camp. In the book Unbroken, it describes that Louis would remember this moment that he saw the Bird as the darkest in his life. Life in this new camp is deplorable. Louis works all day loading coal and performing other tasks. He is becoming increasingly ill. Okay, so the first picture we have is that of Mitsuhiro Watanabe. Louis met this man at the prisoner of war camp in Omori. One description of Watanabe reads, "He was a beautifully crafted man, a few years short of 30. His face was handsome, with full lips that turned up slightly at the edges, giving his mouth a faintly cruel expression. Beneath his smartly tailored uniform, his body was perfectly balanced, his torso radiating power, his form trim. A sword angled elegantly off of his hip, encircling his waist was a broad webbed belt, embellished with an enormous buckle." Our next picture is Radio Tokyo. This is where Louis was taken in November of 1944 and offered a job as a propaganda tool for Japan. But, like all great heroes, he declined. Our last picture is of starved and hungry prisoner of war. And so this is kind of just a good example of what had happened to Louis and his fellow prisoners of war at the camps. They were so hungry that they could see their bones, and basically they were really sick. So we will now return to this after this message.
Finally, on one glorious day in September of 1945, Louis and his fellow POWs received word that the war had ended. They rejoiced that they could finally go home. After taking time to heal in Hawaii, Louis finally reunites with his family in October.
Later, Louis meets and marries Cynthia Applegate. They start their life together but are hindered by Louis's constant PTSD from the war. Louis becomes an alcoholic and struggles to forget his past until one day when Cynthia drags him to a Christian revival. Louis doesn't like it there, but allows Cynthia to take him once more. What the preacher says touches Louis's heart and he decides to turn his life around. Much later in the future, Louis returns to Japan to make peace with his former captives.
Ultimately, survival is a choice, one that Louis made early in his life.